Vienna, March 1938. A 250,000 people are crammed into the great square at the heart of the city, the Heldenplatz, and they are screaming with joy. They're screaming for a man on a balcony. 30 years earlier, this same city had looked at that same man, a penniless would-be artist sleeping in a shelter a few streets from where they now stand, and told him he wasn't good enough for art school. Twice. Vienna had thrown him out into the gutter as a nobody. Now he stands above it like a god. "I can report to history," he tells the roaring crowd, "the entry of my homeland into the German Reich." Austria, his birthplace, a sovereign nation with its own flag and its own government, has just ceased to exist. And it had taken him about 72 hours to erase it, without firing a single shot. But here is what that ocean of cheering faces is drowning out. Days earlier, one man had tried to stop all of this. Not with an army. Austria had no army that could have mattered. He tried to stop Adolf Hitler with the one weapon Hitler feared more than any tank. He tried to let the people vote. This is how Hitler made a whole country disappear, and why he could not allow that vote to happen. Of all the lands Hitler hungered for, Austria was the one closest to him, because it was his. He was born there. He was Austrian, not German at all. And the very first line of Mein Kampf, the book he dictated in prison, was about exactly this: that German Austria must return to the great German motherland. To Hitler, a Germany without Austria was a body missing a limb. There was only one problem. Union between Germany and Austria, the Germans had a word for it, Anschluss, meaning joining, was explicitly forbidden. When the last war ended, the victors had banned the two German-speaking states from ever merging, for the obvious reason. A Germany with Austria bolted on would be bigger and more dangerous than the Germany they had just spent 4 years defeating. So the thing Hitler wanted most was, by treaty, illegal. He had never once let that stop him. And in fact, he had already tried to take Austria, and failed badly. Back in 1934, barely a year into his rule, Hitler's followers inside Austria made their move. Austrian Nazis stormed the chancellery in Vienna and shot the Austrian leader, a tiny, iron-willed man named Engelbert Dollfuss, and left him to bleed to death on a couch while they tried to seize the country in his name. It collapsed. The Austrian army and most Austrians stayed loyal. The coup was crushed, and the plotters went to the gallows. But the real reason Hitler pulled back wasn't Vienna. It was Rome. Because in 1934, Austria had a protector, and his name was Benito Mussolini. Fascist Italy sat right on Austria's southern border, and Mussolini had no wish to see Hitler's Germany swallow the little buffer state between them. The moment the coup broke out, Mussolini rushed Italian troops to the Brenner Pass, the mountain gateway between Italy and Austria, and made himself brutally plain. Come south, and Italy will fight. Hitler, still weak, backed down on the spot and pretended he'd had nothing to do with the affair. In 1934, one strong man had planted himself in the doorway, and Hitler had not dared to test him. By 1938, that strong man was gone. Not dead. Worse for Austria. He had switched sides. Over the next 4 years, Mussolini went from Hitler's obstacle to Hitler's partner. Italy invaded Ethiopia. The world condemned it, and the one great power that stood by Mussolini was Hitler. The two dictators drew together into the alliance they would call the Axis, and somewhere inside that new friendship, Mussolini quietly let his little neighbor go. He signaled to Hitler that he would no longer stand between Germany and Austria. The guard had walked away from his post. Austria was suddenly alone, trapped between a giant that meant to devour it and an old protector who had decided to look the other way. And the man left holding that doomed little country was Kurt Schuschnigg. Schuschnigg was Dollfuss's successor, a serious, bookish, devoutly Catholic man who had inherited an impossible job: keep Austria free against a Germany many times its size, now led by an Austrian obsessed with taking it back. In February 1938, Hitler summoned him. Schuschnigg made the trip up to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, just over the German border in the Alps, expecting a negotiation between two heads of government. What he walked into was an ambush. For hours, Hitler screamed at him, ranting, threatening, reciting Austria's supposed sins, letting the little chancellor catch sight of German generals stationed conveniently nearby, as though the invasion were only minutes away. Then came the ultimatum: hand key posts in your government to Austria's Nazis, beginning with a man named Arthur Seyss-Inquart to be put in charge of the police, or face what follows. Rattled and cornered, certain he had no choice, Schuschnigg signed. He had been forced to invite the wolf indoors and handed the keys to his own security forces. He went home to Vienna knowing his country was draining away by the hour. And then, in the first days of March, this cautious, careful man did something extraordinary. He decided to fight, and the weapon he reached for was democracy. Schuschnigg announced that Austria would hold a plebiscite, a national vote. That Sunday, the 13th of March, every Austrian would go to the ballot box and answer one question: did they want to stay a free and independent Austria? Yes or no? It was a brilliant, desperate stroke, because Hitler's whole case rested on a single fiction, that the Austrian people were aching to join Germany, and that he was merely giving them what they longed for. A free vote threatened to detonate that story in front of the entire world. If Austrians looked at the question and answered yes to independence, Hitler's excuse for marching in would collapse in public, on the record, for everyone to see. He could not let the question be asked. Hitler flew into a fury and moved with frightening speed. He piled troops onto the border. He hurled ultimatum after ultimatum at Vienna, each one landing with a shorter fuse than the last. First, call off the vote. Schuschnigg, abandoned by every friend abroad, gave in and canceled it. Not enough. Next, resign. Then, hand the chancellorship to the Nazi Seyss-Inquart. Inside a single day, the 11th of March, the demands came so fast that a sovereign government simply dissolved under the weight of them. That night, Schuschnigg went on the radio to say goodbye to his country. He told Austrians he was giving way to force, that he would not have German blood shed over him, and he ended with 3 words: God protect Austria. Then he stepped down. There was no longer anyone left to stop what came next. At dawn on the 12th of March, German troops crossed the frontier into Austria. And there was no battle, no resistance at all. The soldiers rolled in, braced for a fight, and were met instead by cheering crowds, ringing church bells, and people hurling flowers onto the tanks. The Germans even gave it a name afterward: the Blumenkrieg, the War of Flowers. And here's the uncomfortable truth: a great many Austrians genuinely welcomed it. Hitler crossed the border himself and drove first to Braunau, the town where he was born, then on through Linz, where he'd gone to school. The further he traveled, the more delirious the welcome grew. What he had planned as a limited takeover swelled, riding that wave of adoring crowds into something absolute. Austria would not be a puppet or a satellite. It would simply be wiped off the map and absorbed, a province of the Reich. which is how he came to be on that balcony above the Heldenplatz, telling history his homeland had come home. A month later, he held his own plebiscite, the vote at last, but on his terms, under military occupation, with the opposition in prison and the ballot rigged from top to bottom. The official result was 99.7% in favor of the Union. Schuschnigg's honest question had been forbidden. Hitler's dishonest one produced the precise number he'd ordered. For most of the world, it was finished before it had properly started. Britain and France protested, filed their objections, voiced the now familiar grave concern, and did nothing again. There was even a bleak logic to their shrug. How do you go to war to liberate a people who were throwing flowers at the men invading them? Austria had, in a sense, walked willingly into Hitler's arms. The map now showed one enormous Germany where two nations had stood, and the men in London and Paris told themselves this too could be lived with. But beneath the flowers, the other face of the Reich reached Austria within hours. In Vienna, Nazi gangs and ordinary mobs turned on the city's Jews at once, dragging them from their homes, forcing them onto their hands and knees to scrub the pavements while crowds jeered and snapped photographs. The persecution that had taken 5 years to build in Germany crashed down on Austria's Jews in a single week. For them, the cheering in the square was the sound of a trap sealing shut. That is what the newsreels of the smiling crowds leave out. The country didn't merely change its flag. For hundreds of thousands of people inside it, a lock had just turned from the outside. So in 3 days, with no war at all, Adolf Hitler had taken an entire nation off the map, folded 7 million new subjects into his Reich, and been welcomed while he did it. In the Rhineland, he had learned that his enemies wouldn't fight over German ground. Now he'd learned something far headier, that they wouldn't fight over anyone else's country either, so long as he could dress the robbery up as the will of the people. Each time he reached further, and each time the hand that was supposed to stop him simply wasn't there. He did not wait long before reaching again. Wrapped around the top of his newly swallowed Austria sat another country cobbled together after the last war, a young, fragile democracy called Czechoslovakia. And along its mountainous western edge lived 3 million German speakers in a region that most people in London and Paris could not have found on a map. Within months, the whole world would know its name. Because it was over that strip of land, the Sudetenland, that Appeasement would finally walk all the way to the edge of the cliff.